Okay.
Do you want me to man that to make sure people can keep getting in?
It's the stream, so they just have the link in our email automatically, and camera and mic is going. Yeah, it's all set. Yeah, people are, I think it said 5 people are in, so.
Oh, fantastic.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, it's that time.
Alrighty. Okay. First, I'd like to begin with some land acknowledgement. Portland, Oregon lies within the traditional homelands of the Multnomah, Oregon City, Tumwater, Watlala, and Clackamas Chinooks, and the Tualatin Kalapuya peoples who were relocated to the Grand Ronde Reservation under the Kalapuya, etc. 1855 ratified treaty, also known as the Willamette Valley Treaty, 1855. Today, these tribes are part of the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde. The Grand Ronde people continue to maintain a connection to their ancestral homelands and maintain their traditional cultural practices. Hello and welcome to my thesis presentation. I'm Veronica Taylor, a second semester thesis student majoring in general fine arts. I was born and raised in the Bay Area in California. I moved to Portland in the summer of 2018 after graduating from Oakland School for the Arts. I began attending Oregon College of Arts and Crafts, but it unfortunately shut down. I then transferred schools and began attending PNCA in the fall of 2019. At PNCA, I dove into making work that explores my identity and mixed with materials that speak to the subject matter of the specific work. I grew up in a diverse area of California, the Bay Area, but not a very diverse city. My parents made a huge effort to get me out of our small town to see what Oakland, Berkeley, or San Francisco had to offer. Most of what they had that Alameda was lacking was diversity and inclusion. At some point, though, we had to go back to our townhome in the suburbs. I stuck out like a sore thumb, or at least I felt like I did. For a long time, I tried to be like the people I was surrounded by. I was confused and unsure where and if I fit in. Hair in particular was and is a huge deal to me and something I struggled with as a child. I looked at both sides of my family and realized I didn't look like either of them when I was young. I just didn't understand how I could look so different from my own parents, especially after seeing how alike my classmates looked to their families. I grew up watching my maternal grandmother curl her blonde short hair every morning, and then I'd also see my paternal grandmother put conditioner rollers and a silk scarf on every night. I was never sure how my hair fit in, but it was clear that hair in general is of high importance. Braids were something I always wanted, but feared asking for. I made a braided quilt about my ancestry and my internal struggle with being mixed. The braids symbolized my attempts to be one race or the other. Braids were something I felt like I couldn't have because I wasn't black enough or was too white. Since then, I've realized I'm simply both and I'm not too much of one or the other. The yarn is man-made acrylic and speaks to me creating my own experience with the tools I have available. These tools are my ancestry and it informs my existence. This quilt is about embracing the awkwardness of being mixed and a refusal to be one or the other. I like to think of this project as something that has enabled me to tie both sides together. It points at the differences in both sides and the white supremacist logic that forces me one way or the other. But I've created a unified culture that is a resolution to these issues. Rather than simply pointing to their differences and my struggle as a biracial child, I found a personal resolution in my work. I unified my ancestors by telling their stories in my quilt and tied me and my own experience in with braiding. I braided their stories. I feel like this action brought me closer to my ancestors and helped reiterate that my existence and experience is informed by their own. I embraced and took influence from the traditions of my ancestors, quilt making, but made it my own. I illustrated the comfort and old stories being passed down with the traditional look of the quilt and the plushness of my braids. I also acknowledge that this unification of both sides is something new and tedious with a delicate and distinctive composition and construction. My quilt has 20 squares total, 6 squares about my immediate family, and 7 for my maternal and paternal lineage. Many of the squares have multiple meanings, however, the maternal and paternal side can be paired up into categories. Place where my grandparents met, significant part of my grandparents' lives, great-great-and-great-grandfather's immigration, great-grandmother's passion, great-grandmother's origin, something each side is known for, and something each side is proud of. My research included accessing Ancestry.com, speaking with family members, and looking at Black female quilt makers. My dad and I created an ancestry tree together when I was in middle school on our trip to Atlanta. We put in all the information he and my grandmother knew. My mom's side is a bit better equipped when it comes to finding dates. We have a family Bible and records that a family member gathered in her own research. When speaking to family members, I try to get them to tell their own stories so I have something to abstract. Most of the subjects or events in my quilt I was not alive for or do not remember well, so it is important for me to place myself in each time period to design the square. For example, my maternal grandparents began dating on October 12, 1962. She explained it in a text message to me. We went to dinner at the gourmet room at the Town and Country, and then went to the Loma Theater in Point Loma to see the movie Cleopatra with Elizabeth Taylor and Richard Burton. Papa bought a suit for it, and I borrowed a dress from a girlfriend because I didn't have any semi-dressy dresses. My grandparents are one of the only couples close to me that was together when I grew up and is still together. Their relationship is one I looked up to and always wanted for myself. I decided to depict their union by abstracting elements from the menu of the restaurant they had their first date at, the gourmet room at the Town and Country. I found a copy of it from 1962 and used the cranes and stars on the cover to make my square. I used red as the background because it was the background on the menu in real life. For each square, I found a similar motif that was somehow a part of the subject or event. Each square has a story to go with it. Each of them are in my thesis paper for those who are interested. But one of my favorite stories to tell is of how my parents met. My parents met at Zurich Hall at San Diego State University in 1984. My mom was dropped off at the dorms by her parents, who left her with a 6-pack of beer. Once her parents left, she followed the music she heard down the hallway with her beer in hand. She found herself in a dorm room with my dad and all of his friends. My dad had begun college at Laney Community College in Oakland in 1982 and had also just moved into the dorms. My mother had just graduated from her high school in Santa Barbara. They were together ever since they met in 1984 and were together a total of 33 years when he passed. Today, April 25th, would have been their 30th wedding anniversary. I chose the colors of this square to mimic those of the San Diego State colors. Zurich Hall and San Diego in general was and is famous for its Spanish architecture and large arches. I decided to abstract the famous arches and design them in the school colors. As I mentioned before, my mother's side was a bit better equipped for ancestral research. A great aunt of mine had the same love for ancestry as I do. She did a deep dive in the 1960s using a family Bible and genealogy records provided by the Church of the Latter-day Saints. The Bible was printed in 1868 and has been in my family since then. It contains everyone's birth, death, and descendants, as well as obituaries or newspaper clippings if available. It was given to me for this project. My aunt traced our family to our origins in North America. We come from the Lovelands, who arrived in 1638. Widow Loveland arrived in Wethersfield, Connecticut with her 3 sons. From them came Abigail Smith, who married John Quincy Adams, the second president of the United States. She then birthed their son, John Adams, who ended up being the 6th. We are related to them through Abigail. I chose to do more research on where the Lovelands resided in Europe. They lived in Norwich, England. Through my research, I was able to find that there were a family of merchants that lived across a field from a church. There is a photo that is suspected to be an almost exact view of what they saw outside their front door, since the church has not changed since they were alive. I used this image to attempt to tie in and build connection to my more distant relatives. I abstracted it by changing the colors as I wanted to keep the view of the church somewhat recognizable. I also did quite a bit of research on the other side of my family. Because they were Black and from the United States, their records were much less reliable and sparse. My grandfather's name, Billy, was recorded incorrectly several times in his lifetime. I was, however, able to piece together where my paternal grandmother's family was likely enslaved. It was in Abbeville, South Carolina. The man's name was Armistead Burr. He was part of Congress until he moved back in 1863 to oversee his orange hill plantation in Abbeville. His mansion hosted the Confederate president and is known as the death place of the Confederacy, as it is where the president decided to end the war. It is now a wedding venue. My paternal great-grandmother, my dad's maternal grandma, Jessie Davis, was born in Abbeville in 1907. The census lists her family as farmers and farm laborers through her childhood. The man who enslaved her ancestors was also the man to write South Carolina's Black laws that made life unbearable for her and her family. She then moved to Chicago to escape the South. She had 9 kids. My grandmother, Pat Dunn, was the first girl and 4th child. She grew up in Evanston, Illinois, right outside of Chicago. She went to school and ultimately became a nurse. She then met my grandfather and got married and had my dad in 1964. My paternal grandparents moved to Oakland from Chicago in 1966. My grandma was a nurse at the Oakland Jail and Highland Hospital. My grandfather came to run his own photography shop on Broadway in Oakland. They lived on Grand Ave, just down the street from the famous Grand Lake Theater. My dad, my grandma, and I went for a stroll on Grand a few months before he passed. My grandma pointed out where they would go for Black Panther Party meetings, which was in their friend's chicken shop. And my dad pointed out where he would meet up with his friends and take the bus to the city. Both of my grandparents were involved in protests in the 1960s and early 70s. I remember my grandma telling me about how my Papa Bill was arrested in Chicago during an MLK protest. She would always note that the only reason she didn't get arrested too was because she was pushing my dad, who was an infant, in his stroller. They were both good friends with Huey P. Newton. My grandmother said he would come over often because he was good friends with them as a couple. She said he would bring over his different wives as well for them to meet. One time, all 3 at once. My dad would take me for drives as a child and show me his house, my godfather's house, their K-12 schools, and pretty much every other significant place. Going to Oakland and seeing these special places was always meaningful to me and brought me closer to my dad. I decided to depict the significance of Oakland to my family by illustrating my grandparents' house on Grand Ave in front of Lake Marion, a staple of Oakland, and something their house sat just down the street from. I chose Golden State Warriors colors, blue and yellow, for the house and background, and I decided to leave the lake green as it is in real life. It's this one. The other side of my dad's family was really intriguing for me to research. I didn't know my dad's grandpa was from the Bahamas until I was in middle school, so it was never talked about much, and I don't have any contact with him currently, so I was curious. My grandpa, Billy Taylor, was born in Miami, Florida in 1934. His mother, Cleo Watkins, was a maid, and his father, Kenneth Taylor, was a landscaper. My great-grandfather, Ken, immigrated to the United States in 1923 from Nassau, Bahamas. My grandfather, Billy, didn't like talking about his childhood, but my dad mentioned he would visit his grandpa Ken in the summers and do landscaping. The naturalization papers list my great-grandfather as 20 years old, white with medium complexion, 6'2", being 145 pounds, having dark brown hair and light brown eyes, and a scar on his left arm when he entered the country on October 15, 1923. He was not white, but mixed native Bahamian and British. He sailed here on the Francis E. to be the service manager at a tire company. It was exciting for me to begin to picture what his life was like and what my grandfather's life was like growing up. I hadn't known my grandpa was from Florida before finding out about my great-grandfather. and I decided to focus on his immigration for the square because it was my entry point into their lives. As well, also because his immigration and naturalization documents provided me with so much information. I illustrated the island so that he was from in front of a palm tree that signifies Miami. I chose to use colorful and vibrant colors, for the square to represent the tropical climate. This is okay. I also chose to fill in the quilt with green. Green is my favorite color, and I see it as something extra to tie my own story/experience into the stories of my ancestors. I've always loved green. Growing up, my brother and I's room was half seafoam green for me and gray for him. We each got 2 walls. My parents didn't want to know my gender when I was born, so all my baby clothes and toys were green and yellow, and I think that's why I like it so much. So it's always been a neutral for me. I specifically chose the shade of green because it's more of a gem tone and fits into the Kool-Aid color palette. I was introduced to the palette through the contemporary black quilt maker, Lisa Butler. Butler frequently uses the palette. The Kool-Aid color palette was coined by the group Afrocobra in the 1960s in Chicago. It's a color palette made by Black people intuitively. It uses vibrant and saturated colors as well as gem tones, speaking to our roots in Africa and the dyes used there. Butler's image sourcing was a large influence for me as well. She uses photos of Black people from the National Archive. However, these photos don't provide a name, place, or time. Many of the photographs are of people just standing on the street. Butler says they're forgotten because they're never correctly acknowledged, and they were nearly actually forgotten until she accessed them. Although Butler's quotes don't provide details such as dates or names, they provide a place to properly remember this person. My quote is a place for me to properly remember, acknowledge, and make a connection to and with my ancestors. Because these subjects are so tender, I wanted to abstract the images I used to protect myself. I've been interested in abstraction for some time, but Rosie Lee Tompkins inspired me to bring that into my life. Tompkins enjoyed keeping her family and art faith separate. Despite this, her works are deeply personal. For example, Tompkins' work, 3 Sixes, 1986, is about her family members' birthdays that are all on the 6th. I really appreciate this gift of personal information with boundaries. She redefined the tradition of quilt making to unify the subject and material while abstracting her experience for personal safety. Some compare it to newspapered walls. Although it may be hard to read, the meaning is there in plain view. After I completed the abstraction of my chosen stories, the quilt making process began. I didn't piece it together like a typical quilt. I decided to create my own way of constructing the quilt as it speaks to me creating my own experience. I wanted to find a physical solution to fit all my ancestor stories as well as my own experience into one piece. I began by gathering my materials. I decided to use embroidery mesh as my substrate and acrylic yarn as my mark making tool. I traced my designs onto the mesh to begin each square. Next, I braided different colors of yarn required to fill in the square. I then hand sewed each braid into the shape of the design. Each square took a different amount of time, but I averaged out to about 3 squares a week. It was then time to make the borders. I cut and taped the embroidery mesh into 20 fitted frames for each of the squares. I then braided, sewed, and trimmed with the same technique as the squares. Throughout this process, I learned a few techniques. I thankfully learned how to embroider. I was struggling with translating the amount of detail I initially designed into braids. It was difficult to have it super clean and detailed with even the smallest braid I could possibly make. My mentor, Sarah, helped me to realize that I could simply embroider the yarn to achieve the look I was searching for. I've been experimenting with applique and using buttons and patches on top of my designs to enhance them, but embroidery allowed me to enhance my design while keeping the all-yarn look I preferred. Before I began the quilt, I performed various tests for how I'll tie off the braid to avoid them coming unraveled. I tried burning, using hair beads, and boiling the ends. I began the quilt by using small rubber hair ties. but I quickly realized that the embroidery mesh was rigid enough to act as a border to tie off the braids. I also began the quilt by using white embroidery floss. This added a lot of time to my process. I had to be very careful to not allow the thread to show, as it didn't match the yarn. I also had to go back after the trimming process and tease the braids to cover the white thread. On my 5th or 6th square, I realized that if I separate the yarn, I have thread that is an exact color match to my braids. Making the quilt was definitely a learning process, and almost every time I had my weekly mentor meeting, I found a better way to do something or learn more about my materials. I am proud of the finished product and to be able to stand in front of it today. However, most of the work I've done is internal and had to do with the acceptance of who I am and came from, and a refusal to be one race or the other. Investigating the lives of my ancestors was exciting and opened my eyes to the nearly infinite amount of stories and perspectives within my own family. This is something I realized early on, however, I didn't begin to consider the depth in our differences until my brother began school. We both have the same parents, but turned out looking a bit different. It's especially noticeable in our skin tones and curl patterns. As I remember it, we often clung to one another in new spaces. We were usually the only 2 kids of color, so we stuck together. I thought his experience with growing up would mimic mine since we were the same in my eyes. I realized our experiences were very different when he began elementary school. He was getting accused of everything that went wrong in the classroom. I remember my parents constantly getting calls and emails from his teacher. I was really confused how Miles got into so much trouble because he was always relatively reserved. The things he usually did do, he got away with since he was so sneaky. It was his 5th grade graduation when it really clicked for me how blatantly racist the school had been and how vastly different our experiences were. The graduation ceremony was over and all the families were meeting their students back in their classrooms. The graduates were all sitting at their desks awaiting class photos. All of the black and brown children, including my brother, were seated in the very back row towards the corner of the classroom. My family was awestruck at the sight and were wondering if it had been this way the whole school year. I couldn't help but remember where my seat used to be in the classroom next door, in the front row. At that moment, I had felt guilty and ashamed that I was treated better. I now realize that I am not the one that should feel guilt, and I shouldn't be ashamed that I happen to fit better into the mold the white supremacy has casted. Our differing experience has brought us as siblings closer. I think it's been difficult for both of us since our dad passed to figure out who we are and where we stand racially. Miles was 12 and I was 16, so we were both in stages of finding and creating our identity. A huge part of who we were disappeared, and it was hard, at least for me, to figure out what I still had claim to after his passing. It's often Miles' teenage, arrogant attitude that snaps me out of this and reminds me that I have claim to whatever I like. I am thankful for my ancestors and what they have provided me with. This project is about me illustrating my love for both sides of my ancestry, regardless of how history has pitted them against one another. All of my work on my ancestry is not only for me, but for my brother Miles. We may have different experiences, but we come from the same people. My goal for this work is to continue to add squares about Miles and me and pass it down as an heirloom of sorts to our descendants. It is also for people to consider what being biracial in the United States is like, and to consider what white supremacist ideologies still exist in the nation that is becoming more mixed. I illustrated my struggle with the push and pull between both of my races with my braids, and embraced their differences and histories by sharing their stories in one piece. Thank you to my mentor Sarah for inspiring me to begin braiding nearly 2 years ago and for continuing to push me to make work I'm proud of. And thank you to my family for providing me with these stories and allowing me to share them. Thank you for coming. Questions? absolutely.
Let me see what I wrote. For this. Each one of these little panels seems like such a rich little nugget of kind of histories and stories, and, you know. But then they're abstracted to a point where they're almost difficult to understand. Without you here, without some sort of guide, how do we access this and kind of get to that richness? Or is it necessary that I do?
It's not necessary that you do. The abstraction was for me to kind of protect these stories and be able to share them at my own leisure to people who I'd like to share them to, but also so that like people walking by would be able to recognize like that's a palm tree or that's a shovel and be intrigued and not have to know the entire story behind it.
I think you sort of helped me answer that question too. You said that you see it as an heirloom.
Yeah.
So maybe the audience is family and it stays.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, I look forward to like passing it down. That's really, my goal.
Yeah, I had a similar, sort of a similar question that you answered. I think for me, there was something else that I caught. You said you wanted to display something that each side is proud of. So I was kind of waiting to hear about that. I mean, if you want to point out, that's fine, but it's, I think, as you were describing it, that became one of the things that I was really intrigued about because when you're doing a project that's like difficult and deeply biographical and kind of mining a lot of this family history, you know, there's this part about telling that story, and then there's also a part where you can focus on, like you're saying, these things that are about like a kind of pride or something like that. So, yeah, it just made me curious about if that presence is also abstracted in here, or if it's something that kind of we might be able to read.
I feel like that presence is kind of abstracted, but specifically those stories that I mentioned were, so for my dad's side, something each side is proud of is the dumb smile, which is their famous gap. And on my mom's side, we did the shovel, because my grandpa, my mom, and my uncle were all in the water industry, and my grandpa was very proud of that and what he's done in Santa Barbara. So yeah, it's kind of like abstracted through it, and like I feel like it's also a part of like the stories and the stories I chose. I tried to choose stories that my family was most proud of. Yeah.
I was just really curious to know which square taught you the most and which one was your favorite to make in terms of, the construction.
Which square? I would probably say this square taught me the most because that's the one I learned to separate out the thread, which sped up my process. And my favorite square to make, I would probably say this one, which ended up being my last square that I completed. And it was the most fun because I figured out embroidery. It was really exciting to see the islands, or the lakes within the island come together and the leaves on the palm tree.
Jump back in again. Would you say that the more intimate, the sort of deeper stories that you want to protect are more abstracted? Sort of a follow-up, I guess, to my own question. I'm curious about, there's 2 pounds that you introduce a text. You got 88, as a graduation thing, and then Rancho, Oregon. That shifts, right? As soon as you see text, I start to think, okay, that's the didactic, that's the legend, that's the guide, to this piece. Talk about your choice of just communication there.
Well, for the 88, that was, the year was specifically important to me because, this square is about my mother being the first woman in her family to graduate from college. And so that year being included was really important. And honestly, when I think of the 80s, I kind of think of like bubble letters, and so that's kind of the aesthetic that I went with. And this one over here is about my great grandmother moving from, so this is her county, Abbeville, the outline of it, and it has a little star where she lived. And then this is her house in Illinois. And then Rancho, it's actually Drive, is where she moved to California. So this one's about like her travel through the United States. And so they're kind of specifically included. But I think I would like to go back and add some dates on other ones. I didn't realize about the embroidery until later on, and so I kind of experimented with using it with text, and now I'm thinking it might be nice to embroider dates if I'm going to pass it down, so that is half. Sorry, I'm not sure that answers your question, it kind of rambled.
Well, it's funny, again, thinking of this thing as this object as an heirloom that gets passed on. And I think we always had a trunk full of all the important stuff, in our attic. And a lot of the times there was a necessity of my mom and my dad walking us through that. Oh, this is your cousin, this is your uncle, this is your sort of thing. So do you see that kind of responsibility attached to you?
Yeah.
Sort of shepherd and carry us forward with the stories?
Yeah, absolutely. That's exactly how I imagine it, as it being like something. Yeah, they take down and share, or I take down and share with my descendants later on and go through. And I think that the installation of it is something I'd also like to pass down. It's like individually nailed in, and like I would like to be able to like teach my descendants, my kids, and my brother's kids how to put it up in like that whole process.
So is each one an individual square?
Yep, and then the borders are also individual, like they're separate.
Oh, I see. So if I can just point out, this section here is like separate than this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Brought them here, all the squares were in one bag and the borders were in another.
Does that imply that it can have multiple iterations and compositions?
Yeah.
Let's say if your brother had it, would it be a whole other?
Yeah, probably. And also with the adding of new squares, and like it also takes the ability, like if, I don't know, I'm kind of imagining if there's like a family reunion and one side is there and one side's not, they'd have the ability to put one side squares up and be able to show that. That's more like further down the line, but yeah. So yeah, I imagine it is kind of changing and like the squares being changed out or being edited throughout time.
And you also mentioned the possibility of it growing or continuing.
Yeah, I kind of was thinking that I might make a square for my brother and I, maybe like every year, and that maybe just my project, my ongoing project. And that way I'll have kind of like the story of all those who come before me, and then my own story by the time I die. But yeah.
You mentioned the source of the color palette and your choices there, the vibrancy. I'm trying to get a question out of this, not a comment. Is there, not a danger, is there a fear that the consistency in the palette kind of homogenizes all the experiences? Or is that an intention that it does unify? Or, I mean, I look at like 88 seems really important, and then there's a sort of leopard print underneath. Same palette, same color intensity. I guess I'm asking, is there does the color choice deny a kind of hierarchy of importance of these little moments?
No, it was really intuitive for me, like the process, and I also tried to choose colors that were like specific to the event. Like the 88 one, the colors like the yellow, and I specifically chose because it was in Southern California and it's sunny, and that's what I think of. And then this is the school color. So yeah, it wasn't like a hierarchy necessarily. It was kind of individually kind of fitting, deciding what colors look best. And then once they were all designed, like figuring out composition that spreads out the colors well enough. And yeah.
Maybe a follow-up question to that would be, you don't necessarily have to tell me the story behind it, but if there is one, but are like, for example, the panel that David pointed out, or the one with the 3 colored dots, or this one, are they equally symbolic for you?
Yeah, so I would like, I forget which one of you guys mentioned earlier, but like the level of abstraction for like the personal stories. Like as you said, that I kind of realized that I did that subconsciously. I would say this story is like the closest to me. This square is about this, it represents my mom and then me and my brother with all of our favorite colors, surrounded by my dad's favorite color, blue. And it's about the 3 of us being left after he passed. And then the zebra square is about his cancer. He had neuroendocrine cancer, which is a zebra cancer. The color for it was teal blue like this, which is actually why I chose that color for this whole palette. And then instead of just having it the light blue and white, I added his favorite color in. So yeah, there's kind of like, I mean, yeah, subconsciously abstracted them more, but also, yeah, I just had a hard time figuring out how to depict such heavy things, and I thought just kind of symbolically was the best.
I think you articulated it very well, that it's interesting choice that abstraction becomes the level of closeness or how much to reveal, and I think that's smart in terms of, I think there's always this tension between, right, okay, you have a project, there's a conceptual sort of drive behind it, how much of that is legible, how much are you as a maker responsible to, audience, and then also, who is audience in that case, and I think you've done a really good job by in a way saying, okay, this is an heirloom, and I'm going to take it out of that sort of circulation and occasionally display it here. I mean, you could read it as just an aesthetic object, but it really does require you to be here, so there's this very strong storytelling component to it, right? Which is kind of the nature of a quilt anyway. So how, I guess, you're so open and sharing things that I think would be very difficult for a lot of people to share. Do you see yourself presenting this again and kind of sharing this, and like, if you were to do a talk or something, would you share in a similar way?
Yeah, I think so. I think I'd probably like fine tune the script for like wherever I was showing. But I don't like writing the script and thinking about like what stories I wanted to tell. Like it was really important for me to like kind of know where I was showing and who would be in the room. Like my mom and my grandma. It was important for me to tell those stories. And so yeah, I would kind of like tweak what stories I told, and maybe some stories would be like more relevant depending on like whatever current events. Like I could talk more about my grandparents protesting, or discuss my great grandpa in San Diego with avocados, which I didn't even touch on here. And so like I have a variety of things I feel like I would pick and choose depending on the audience.
Yeah, I think you've landed on a really smart, successful form and way, because like I said, you kind of circumvent some of that expectation, right? If we're like, oh, okay, it's not for us per se, like some idea of this audience with a capital A, but it's really for you and your family that you kind of occasionally share, and then fulfills the kind of function of what we expect of our person. Then, I really appreciate that part of it. So, because I think that legibility can be really a tricky thing, and how much you're like obligated to share, especially as an artist of color. There's certain expectations about legibility that come with the territory too, that I think you're smart to kind of, choose or decide not to engage in.
Absolutely. Yeah, and it feels like I have more ownership of my work that way as well. And yeah, much more control over who sees it and how they see it. I am confident in how it looks and like it being aesthetically pleasing and intriguing. And but like the real satisfaction for me is like just sharing it with my family and like a few of you guys and like being able to tell me and my family's stories.
The craft allows it to have a certain ambiguity because I'm convinced of your conviction to make these sort of images. And if it was a little rougher, a little more sort of shoddily constructed, I get to dismiss that ambiguity. But these are little nuggets of intentionality, which is really, pretty potent.
Thank you.
You also you see it as almost I think of like the little sampler primer kind of needlework things. I mean, could avocados be a trigger for a whole other quote just on that story? The great smile, could that be a whole series of portraits? So this is just going to this is your life's work.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I'm probably going to take a little bit of a break from reading for now. But,
30, 40 minutes.
yeah. And then, I want to keep going. I love this work and I love this, like the aesthetic of it. And the meaning of the braids is, I feel like, something that like made me the artist that I am. And it's exciting to continue to like speak to it in like an aesthetically pleasing way. But also one that means something.
Did the idea of making this for your family, did that free you from certain expectations or certain kind of pressures you might have felt? Okay.
No, I had actually done a painting a year ago about my family's origins in California. And like when I was done with it, like my teacher asked me what I was going to do with it. And I never did, but I plan to do it to my brother because we share the same lineage. And so from then on, I thought about always sharing my work about my ancestry with them.
I also think of quilts, the whole sort of quilting circle, that collective social moment. Do you imagine a quilting circle, quilting being with family members? I mean, directly kind of doing the work?
Not specifically, but my mom and my grandma taught me how to sew and everything growing up, and were really a huge part of me like falling in love with fibers and knitting. I was obsessed with crocheting as a kid, so yarn and fabric has always been a part of my life.
Can I have one? Actually, I hate to do this, but since I know your family's here, can I ask them a question?
Yeah, absolutely.
That's okay, sorry.
Yeah.
When you look at this, we talked about the abstraction and not having some access to them outside the family. How do you navigate this? Do you instantly trigger to that color, that shape of the forms? Is there some ambiguity there for you? How do you navigate this area?
As Veronica said, the pieces that are the three of us and Mike's cancer and my breast cancer, and those are the last 4 years or 3 years of our lives as a family. So those bring a lot of, so having those more abstract and is feels good. I mean, it's not, but the details of the others, like I can remember, mom and dad telling me the story of their first date and going to my late husband's house on Grand Avenue and being there in college, to San Diego State, to I went to Evanston. I used to go to Chicago a lot and go to Evanston, and went with Granny was there at the time, and I went to their old house and she showed me all the old places, and so it pulls all those memories of the different parts of the life that I was able to share with her to have for 33 years.
Thank you.
I suppose I can't stop but say some things. So I have had the pleasure of working with your daughter, granddaughter, best friend, for the whole pandemic, as we've been back in this deal, 2 years. And it on a regular basis saved my life, getting to be the teacher person for you. So thank you for putting her on the plan and getting them here. I feel like we all kind of collaborated really hard through the stratosphere, because I know you guys were in on this the whole way too. And so I would get her, and she got her things, and I'd be like, oh, ask for this, go get you something. Like, so it's a long time coming, I'm sitting in this room, so thank you for making the trip. Having to do with us sharing this experience and this threshold that you brought us to, I'm really grateful for how everybody has contributed to this conversation. And because I'm a talker and I can't stop, and I'm really invested in this. I think it's a really important moment in social justice and contemporary fine art because of what you have achieved personally, internally and externally. And I think that it's such a power move to create this thing that absolutely ratifies your living people and the ancestors, and does not say too much about the oppressor at all. We take up all this space to do this thing, and to say, and to publicly say, and professionally say, and formally say, this is for my family. And you are lucky enough to have any access to it at all. I'm gonna contribute this as the highest importance into the canister of the history that we're collectively making, those who are writing it through the oppressed lens. It's really, really exciting to me. And I think it's brilliant, these questions that kind of speak to those old conventions, and that we can sit here and break through that with a quill. We not even are. It's just so brilliant. And I think that your intellectual property that you created along the way, and how you just deliver that, and that you're recording it, and that people are from the internet all around the country with us. Like, there's so many really exciting, provocative things happening right now that we will continue to feast on through the rest of our time. So congratulations and bravo, I'm so proud of you. Thank you.
I would just like to say that ever since Ronnie was born and to hold a pencil in her hand, she was drawing from day one almost. And anywhere we went, she had her sketch pad, she had crayons, she had pencils, and just to watch her progress through these years, she came down to the sewing class in Southern California and was interested in that. And just her enthusiasm, and then to see her come full circle. Well, not full circle because there's so much more to come. I can't wait to see it, but I'm just so proud of her and the education she's gotten and be able to pursue her artistic. My family has no artistic, so it's just wonderful, and I'm just so proud of her.
Thank you very much. Thank you guys all for coming. Gosh. Bye guys on the stream. Thank you.
It's recorded. Got it.